such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the awful case of Kedarie Johnson. Was he killed for gender identity? Now, this was a family that moved to a safer environment, a child that had overcome the bullies, and an accepting community. So how did this tragedy occur? Was it hate? Was it pride? Or was it random? By the way, it is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and if you would like to support me in doing so, all you have to do is make sure you're subscribed down below, give this video a thumbs up, and comment something nice. Now let's get back to the story. By the way, I want to say that 2 shows are out right now on this particular case. It is True Life Crime on MTV and Killer Motive on Oxygen. They both have segments on Kedarie's case. If you'd like to watch it, as they did give me so much information as far as what happened to Kedarie. So it was 2016 in Iowa, and the Johnson family lived in Burlington. It was a pretty small town. 15 years ago, they had moved to this tiny town from the bustling city of Chicago, and this decision was made by their single mother, Katrina, to give them a new life and to really just have a fresh start, because they had kind of went from homeless shelter to homeless shelter in Chicago. The children really weren't having the best time at school, and so they decided it was best to move on. And the 3 siblings were Cedric, Nyjah, and Kedarie, and they were all very, very close. They bonded super well. They were very supportive, and this was the whole family. They really had such a beautiful family situation, even though they had gone through struggles, and they really had each other's backs at all times, which was going to be needed. Kedarie would even work odd jobs to help out with the money. He would work at Taco Bell or anywhere he could make money so he could help out with the rent, and his family meant everything to him. Now, his brother Cedric actually remembers a time when they were a little younger, and Cedric had actually gone to the store and stolen a Twix bar, and he ran home and he had told his mother that it was actually Kedarie who had stolen this Twix bar. And so Kedarie walked in and got in trouble immediately, was sent to the corner, and was in trouble for something that Cedric did. But instead of being angry at Cedric, he just accepted it. He didn't tell his mother that he was wrong or that she was wrong, and he also even shared his food with Cedric later that night. He didn't hold a grudge at all, and he was just such a wonderful soul that was willing to help anybody, even if they didn't necessarily deserve it. Kedarie was said to have so many friends. He was outgoing, loud, the life of the party, and he just truly didn't care what people thought about him. And that's something that everyone loved to be around, because they wished that they were almost more like him. But this wasn't always the case. You see, Kedarie had come out as gay when they lived back in Chicago, and as much as he felt a relief for being able to be himself, the world was not as kind back. And Kedarie's classmates would often bully him, and about a year after he came out, he came home crying and he couldn't talk. His voice was like mumbled, he had blood in his mouth, and it actually turned out he had a broken jaw. And at first he wouldn't talk about what happened, he wouldn't tell anyone, but then it later came out that he had actually liked a boy, and he turned out to be a straight boy. And Kedarie's friends had told this straight boy that Kedarie liked him, and apparently liking somebody was not okay in the straight boy's eyes, and he went and he punched Kedarie, and that's how he got his broken jaw. So with the family's support, they all decided to move away for a better life for literally everyone. And after the move, Kedarie really would find himself even more. He began to wear t-shirts kind of upside down with the collar over his forehead and the rest of the t-shirt kind of hanging back as though it was his hair. And he would start to dress more feminine. And he was always into dolls and purses. And although items and fabric can be gendered, I don't necessarily agree with the fact that they have to be a female or a male's item. It's just, you know, it's fabric or it's an object, and that to me doesn't really make any sense. But unfortunately, a lot of people do not find this acceptable. Thankfully though, this didn't stop Kedarie from being who he wanted to be, and he began to grow out his hair as well as wear weaves, wear braids, and his mother would then be told by him that he was actually gender fluid. And his mother was completely okay with this, only saying that that was a dangerous lifestyle and he needed to make sure with everyone he came in contact with that he was completely honest, and told them who he was and said it proudly. And this is when Kedarie actually started wearing more of the feminine clothing to school, and he let everyone know just who he was. Now at this point, Kedarie was going by he, his, him pronouns, as well as sometimes using she or her pronouns as well. But that was just on occasion, and his family said, you know, we will call you whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever you want, just let us know. However, he was most often going by Kedarie, by he, him. And so that is how most of his family, that's how all of his family refers to him as well as his friends, until on certain occasions he wanted to go by she, whether that was for the day or the hour or the week or whatever. So that is what I'm going to be referring to him as well, just because that is what his family and friends do, and I want to be the most respectful and accurate that I can be. And now for anyone who isn't aware, I want to go a little bit into gender fluidity and being gender fluid, and this is something that I am by no means an expert in. In fact, I was researching because I want to become more aware. I just wasn't quite aware of how everything worked and how gender fluid people feel and what that truly means. So in case you're the same way, I want to kind of share my knowledge in hopes that you can learn from it too. And if there's any more that can be learned about it, I'd love to hear it down below from anybody who knows. But from what I found about being gender fluid is that you just do not have a single fixed gender, that you can kind of shift from one to the other. And in that means that, you know, one day you can feel like you are more masculine, and the next you can feel like you are more feminine, or you could even switch within the day or within the hour. It's really just each individual and how they feel. It's not transgender is where you want to completely change your gender, but you want to kind of go back and forth and you don't feel the need to confine yourself to one. And I found that with gender fluid humans, they truly do have different ways of wanting to be spoken to and acknowledged as far as their pronouns. Some just go by their birth pronoun, and some go by the opposite pronoun, but some do go by both pronouns, and you kind of have to ask them on the daily what they would like to be acknowledged as. There's also those that go by they and them, and who don't necessarily even want to be associated with, you know, he or she. They're just a they or them, and those are all just a personal choice. And this is a huge part of Kedarie and who he was, and I really wanted to dive into that before we move forward, because I think it's very important in this case to know a little bit more, and I hope that I did okay in explaining that. I mean, no disrespect if I got anything wrong, because I want to become more aware and just knowledgeable about the whole thing. So Kedarie was a normal 16-year-old at this point. He was happy, he was loud, he was full of life, but he was also extremely brave, because he was so kind to a world that hadn't been kind back to him, and he truly found strength in his struggles, and he wasn't going to let other people stop him from being himself. In fact, he didn't hold back any of his personality at all. Everybody knew who Kedarie was. Everybody knew his soul. Now in school, he was always a class clown. He was making everyone laugh. Well, almost everyone. That's the problem. Nobody is going to be loved by everybody. And there were people who didn't think that Kedarie was funny, didn't like his antics, and this is kind of what would happen on March 2nd. And Kedarie would actually throw a hair pick at a student, and the student was not very happy, and they began to kind of have a fight, a little minor fight, and that is when they were both sent to the principal's office, and the principal would basically suspend Kedarie and send him home. He wasn't going to be with nothing to do. They knew that Kedarie was someone who liked to go, liked to work for his family, so they said, look, you're going to be suspended, But there's actually a clothing expo going on at the local auditorium, and you could work there and make some money over the next couple of days to keep you busy, to get some money coming in for your family. It's not something you have to do, but if you want to, there's definitely an option. So it's not like they were completely against him, the school staff. They still wanted to help, but it had gotten to the point where Kedarie was getting in like little tiny fights and trouble here and there, and they had to do something about it to let him know that wasn't okay to disturb school. Kedarie's mother, Katrina, was still at work when he had called her and told her what had happened. She told him that he should go home and stay inside, not to go outside, because she was still at work and she wanted him to be safe, and she wasn't necessarily mad. She just told him to stay safe. She would be home later that night. But unfortunately, Kedarie couldn't just sit at home, and he decided to go to the local HyVee to use the Wi-Fi to do some homework. He could sit at the little deli and do it there. Then at about 10 p.m. he would call his mom and tell her the truth and say, you know, look, I'm at HyVee. I didn't obey your rules. And she immediately told him he needed to get home. He said, okay, see you later, Ma, I love you, and hung up. And she thought he was going to be going home, but he did not. Now, it would be an hour and a half later at 11:30 when 911 would be called, because the community, the homeowners in this area, were saying that they had just heard gunshots, 7 of them. Now, one caller said it was coming from the local alley, and 6 minutes later the police would arrive, but they could not have imagined what they were about to see. There was the body of a young individual lying in the grass next to this alley, and upon arriving, they noticed the extremely strong odor of bleach. Now, the body was lying there in the grass, but the head was covered because there was actually a trash bag over it. And when they went and they got the trash bag off, they immediately knew who this victim was because they knew Kedarie. Now, there was also a trash bag stuffed in his mouth. He had bullet wounds, 2 of them to the chest, and he had bruises all over. His shirt was rolled up as though he had been drugged, and it was exposing 2 bras, one white and one black. And you could also see his private area as his pants were pulled down a little bit as well. His hair was in long braids, and they could tell that hair had been pulled out from his scalp. He had been doused in bleach, and the bottle was just lying between his legs. It was a Dollar General store brand, and it just appeared as though it had been tossed on him after they were done pouring it. And his cause of death was the gunshot wounds, but the strangulation from the bag had occurred a bit before, because there were markings along the bag as though he had been clawing at it trying to get off. So he had been shot after that bag was put on him. But DNA evidence could not be found because the bleach had been poured all over. Whoever had done this had thought it through, and although there were blue fibers found on Kedarie's body, but nobody knew what they could have been from. But now his family needed to be informed, and this would be the hardest part. An officer would go to Katrina, and she would go in and she would say, can you tell me what Kedarie was wearing yesterday when he left for school? And Katrina said, actually, I have a picture, and showed it to her. And this officer said, can you please sit down? And that is when she informed Katrina that her son was dead. And Katrina started screaming and crying and asking why and who had done this. And it was not anything that a mother should have to ever go through. But while this was happening, the news was spreading all over town of what had happened, and everybody at school began to talk about it, and it was spreading like wildfire, and nobody believed it at first until all of Kedarie's friends were in the office together, and they started to realize that it was true. The school counselor remembers the amount of crying that was happening throughout the hallways, and an announcement was actually made to confirm what everybody had been hearing so that they knew it wasn't a rumor. And it was just an all-around horrific day for everybody, because nobody expected this to happen in such a small town, especially not so brutally. And a vigil was then put together starting in the alley where Kedarie had been found. And at this point, a funeral was also put together, but they couldn't just have it at a normal funeral place because so many people wanted to attend that they actually had to do it in the school gymnasium, and there wasn't even enough seats. They had to have people just stand along the wall. But investigators were doing their part, working hard to figure out what had happened that night, how Kedarie ended up in that alley. And they found from the HyVee surveillance footage, they found him at HyVee, just as he said he was. And he was walking around in a pink headband with black and goldish blonde hair. He was also wearing a black shirt, black and white leggings / joggers, as well as black and white sneakers, and he was also carrying a backpack. They watched him walk out of this HyVee. He was bubbly, he was happy, he seemed like he was smiling, and that is when they didn't know where he had gone next. But a friend of Kedarie's would come forward. Her name was Amari, and she had said she had seen Kedarie that night after he'd gone to HyVee. He had walked 2 blocks to her house, which was actually in the opposite direction of his own house where he was supposed to be going, and he had gotten to her house to try on some bras because they often would exchange clothing and just talk about stuff like that. And so he was going to borrow some of her bras, and he was just talking when all of a sudden he kind of looked fearful, and Amari asked him why, and he said to look outside, and she did. She kind of saw a car. It was dark outside, so it was hard to see, but she saw a car outside of her window, which was strange. It was like parked outside of her home, and that's when Kedarie said he was being followed by someone named Lumney. Amari said that her mom could give him a ride home, that she could walk with him with her big dog so that they wouldn't be hurt. She just didn't want him to go alone, but Kedarie said he was fine. He didn't need any of that, so he left, and shortly after that, he would be murdered. Amari said that she watched him go, and the red car pulled away shortly after he left. She said all she could see was that it was red, not the plate number, not what kind of car it was, but it was gone not too long after Kedarie was. Witnesses around the alley who called 911 that night about the gunshots said that they had also seen a very strange blue, older looking van across the street from this alley that night, and they really didn't know it to be from the area, and they were concerned it had something to do with Kedarie's murder. So they called it in, and police actually found the owner of this car and brought him in really quickly, and it was found that this man had parked there. It was actually like a teenage boy, I believe, had parked there so that he wouldn't be parking in front of his girlfriend's home, and then she actually drove them to wherever they were going and would drop them back off at his van. Text messages between the two would prove this and basically eliminate them as suspects. So now they were back to square one once again. At this point, with nothing else to go on, investigators decided to go back to the only information they had really about Kedarie, and that was at HyVee. They had a picture of him walking around, this video of what he was doing, and they got to the point where he was walking outside, and that is when they saw a red car pull out of the parking lot as well. So that is when they kind of backtracked, and they found when this car pulled in, and it was after Kedarie was already inside HyVee, and this car pulled up, and it was a red Chevy Impala, and one man got out of the car, walked into HyVee, and then there was another man who walked from wherever he was coming from to HyVee, and these two men met up. And they weren't really around Kedarie. They didn't seem to be talking to Kedarie, but after Kedarie had walked out, they both went together into this red car, and they went in the same direction as Kedarie. So could these two men have had something to do with the murder? Well, if they did, investigators now had their faces on their surveillance footage. They just had to find out who they were. That's when they began to focus on Amari's witness statement that said that Kedarie was afraid of a man named Lumney. So they typed this into Facebook, not knowing who this was, and thankfully it popped up. This was actually a nickname of a man, and this was on his Facebook profile, and then they were searching through his friends list, and they'd searched Johnson, and they found that he was friends with a girl named Candace Johnson, and they thought maybe she was related to Kedarie. But it turned out that Candace was actually Kedarie. Candace is what Kedarie went by when he was identifying more as a female, and he had this whole Facebook page for Candace as well. And Lumney was friends with Candace, but not with Kedarie. The man that was said to be Lumney was actually Jorge Sanders Galvez, and they actually had to do some searching, some interviewing to figure out who the other man was, and his name was Duran Perham. He was often called Wicked West as a nickname, and they were both from St. Louis, Missouri. So what were they doing in Burlington? They actually often came to Burlington. They had friends, they had family, and they had a friend who would let them stay at her house at 2610 Madison. So they basically had a perfect place to, party, bring girls, and get away from their home for a while. And once investigators found out that this is where they often stayed, they went to go talk to them. They knew that they probably wouldn't be at this home, but if they weren't, Duran's girlfriend often stayed at this home as well, so they were going to talk to her, and either way they were going to get some sort of information. So they headed there, and this was actually only 2 miles from the alley where Kedarie's body was found, but no one would answer the door. But this wouldn't be the end of their lead, because they would begin to peer through windows looking for anything that they could see that would be incriminating. And that is when they looked in the garage window, because of course they were looking for this red Impala, and they peered through and they would find a black garbage bag with black garbage bags in the trash, and these did appear to be identical to what was found on Kedarie's head. Was this a coincidence, or was this a clue? Well, they decided that that was enough to get a search warrant for the property, and so they went inside and they began to film the home while they did the search warrant, as they often do now, and they would walk upstairs to find a backpack. Inside, they would find Kedarie's school ID. His black and white shoes were also found there, and they also found sheets that were thought to be the same color. They were ripped up sheets, and they were thought to be the same color as the blue fibers on Kedarie's body. So they brought all of that in. They also collected ammunition, a hammer, a fake fingernail, and used condoms for evidence as well. They were also informed that Duran's girlfriend had a red Impala that he often used. That is when an APB was put out in Missouri, where they lived, as well as in Iowa. And the only problem was they now didn't know where these two men who were thought to be killers were, and they also didn't know where their murder weapon was. It would take them 2 days to get a tip, and this was in Missouri. The car had been seen, and a chase had ensued in Missouri of this red Impala, and then it actually crashed into a police car, and this driver got out on foot and began to run, where they had to chase him as well, on foot now, and they did get him. They tackled him, brought him in, and it was Duran. He was now in custody, and they also found a revolver in the car. He was brought in for questioning, and he quickly began to tell the story of what happened that night. And he said that they had seen Kedarie outside of HyVee. They thought that Kedarie was a beautiful female and biological female, and so they picked him up. They were like flirting with him. They didn't force him to get in, but he got in, and that is when they would take him to Amari's house, which is where they sat and waited for him until he came back out, got in their car, and they were driving. And Kedarie really seemed to be into Jorge, and Duran could kind of feel this, and so he said, look, why don't you just drop me off at a friend's house and you guys can have your alone time. And so he said he was dropped off at this friend's house and had no idea what happened afterwards. So this friend of Duran was talked to and said that Duran was never at his house that night. April 12th, a month later, Jorge was spotted in St. Louis, and another chase occurred, but he was brought in as well, and he was less willing to talk. And at this point, everything that came out of Duran's mouth was thought to be a lie. So they really didn't have anything. And Jorge was saying that he didn't know Kedarie, he never talked to him, he had never been with him. Although they weren't confessing, investigators truly believed that they were the right men, that they were Kedarie's murderers. And they believed these two men had picked up Kedarie on the side of the street, thinking that he was a biological female and not just identifying as female, and they were going to take him back to the home on Madison Street, and they were going to have sexual relations, but when they realized he was not biologically female, they got aggressive and angry, and they ended up killing Kedarie. Duran and Jorge were put on trial and charged with first-degree murder, and Jorge was actually found to have a 3-year-old child and also a criminal record for disorderly conduct, car theft, assault of a woman he was seeing by punching her and throwing her down a flight of stairs, as well as theft of controlled substance and unlawful possession and use of a weapon. In evidence presented at trial, Jorge was found to be Googling murder in Burlington right after the murder and reading a whole bunch of different articles. And there was also 300 pages of other documents at this trial that were presented to have evidence against these two men. Gerard had been found with the gun that was now confirmed to be the murder weapon against Kedarie. There was also evidence that Kedarie could have been sexually assaulted, but this was not confirmed. Now, Duran's phone was actually tracked through GPS to be in the vicinity of the actual alley during the time of the murder, and although Duran's defense said that he wasn't actually the one who did the killings, he was just the bystander, and Jorge was the one who murdered, they actually both pled not guilty but were sentenced to life without parole. Now, although this did get Kedarie some amount of justice and these two men were behind bars, his friends and family continue to fight for further justice, and they're fighting for this case to be tried as a federal hate crime. Now, not only would that mean that his two killers would be given the death penalty, or could be given the death penalty, it's more than that. It's that Kedarie's case is just being looked at as almost a random murder, rather in the public's eyes, rather than it being a hate crime, which does not necessarily bring awareness to the fact that this could have been done because he was who he was. I mean, this could have been done because he was an LGBTQ plus individual, meaning that he was harmed for being different, for having a fluid gender, for wanting to be both female and male. And these kind of hateful acts are what is happening all over the world, and it's something that isn't being talked about. And the fact that this isn't charged as a hate crime just means it's one less case to say, hey, look, this is happening. And although we don't want more of these to be happening to prove that this did happen, and so to make it a hate crime would just add to the number of victims that we can say this is happening to, this needs to change, and this is not okay. Now, Iowa doesn't have a hate crime law for gender identity, which is why it would need to be a federal trial. But was this a hate crime, or was this something more? You see, I told you that Kedarie had a second page for when he was identifying as female, this Candace Johnson profile, and on this page some strange things would be posted the day of his disappearance. There was some posts from a user named Nathaniel Jones, and at first they were loving and caring and kind of like, how are you, babe? Kind of like a relationship type of thing. But later they turned aggressive and were saying that they were going to beat Candace up, and Candace was saying, calm down to all of this. Candace's friends began to ask her who this Nathaniel was, or why he was trying to say he wanted to beat her up, or why he was being lovey-dovey, and she kind of said that he was her internet boyfriend, but never really explained any further, and her friends never met this Nathaniel and didn't know who he was, which was super strange because normally Candace was very open about everything to all of her friends. This all happened the day Kedarie, or Candace, was murdered. And it was theorized by the True Life Crime episode on MTV that possibly Nathaniel was Jorge, and that maybe Jorge didn't want to tell the world that he was in a relationship with Candace. I mean, his real profile, the one that says Lumney, the one that says Jorge, is friends with Candace, but not with Kedarie. Jorge had been in group chats with Candace, but they hadn't ever spoken directly. Was this because Jorge didn't want the world to know about the relationship they had, or was this possibly Jorge catfishing Candace by using this Nathaniel profile, and maybe Candace found out about it? In that case, was this some sort of secret love, or was it a plan by Jorge to break Candace's heart? Was it some sick prank to get back at Candace for being who she was? Or was this something else entirely? Did this have nothing to do with the fact that Kedarie would later be brutally murdered? Now, Jorge, during interrogation, had said he didn't know Kedarie, but he had called Kedarie homophobic slurs. But wouldn't that show that Jorge knew Kedarie to an extent? Or at least had heard of him? And what I don't really understand is that Jorge was friends with Candace and knew what Candace looked like, all dressed up. So wouldn't he have been able to recognize Candace? Especially when she got in the car. You know, I could see it's dark outside, them just pulling alongside. Maybe they don't know that it's Candace or Kedarie. When Candace got in the car, wouldn't they have recognized her? Whatever you think about this case, Nathaniel Jones has never been identified, and I just have to wonder if it does have something to do with what happened to Kedarie. His mother, Katrina, has said, "I have always said it was a hate crime. I had to view his crime scene photos, and the photos in itself, it screams hate crime all over it. Dealing with a mother's pain like that is something you could never be ready for. I don't care how strong she is, you can never be prepared to actually come face to face with the person that has participated in taking your son's life." Kedarie's brother Cedric has said he wants people to step away from their own pride, to stop being so tough, and that maybe these hate crimes will end. His friends believe that Kedarie was actually in a relationship with Jorge. Now, whether that was serious or just like a casual fling, but they do believe that Jorge killed Kedarie so that he wouldn't tell anybody of their relationship, because Jorge was either ashamed or upset about who he was or didn't want it to get out in some way for some reason. But the awful thing is we still don't know what happened, and for many who don't deep dive into this case, they just believe, oh, it was a random murder, that these two just, decided that they were going to kill. But there's so much more to that, because it almost does appear in my eyes that Candace and Kedarie were killed for the fact that they were gender fluid, that they were not biologically a female. And the thing is, Kedarie wasn't harming anybody. Kedarie was the one who told others to be themselves and wanted them to love themselves and didn't want anybody to stop being who they were for other people. And that's exactly how he lived. And his life should not have been taken for that. This is not a unique case either. This is something that happens to so many LGBTQ plus individuals everywhere who just want happiness, love, and respect, just like the rest of us. They don't want anything more than to be treated like a human that they are. They want what all humans want. And why can't they have that? They bleed like us. Their skeletons look exactly the same as ours. Who someone identifies as, who they love, who they worship, what they look like, should not make them scared for their own lives. And it makes me ashamed of our whole society that anybody is scared for being who they are if they are doing nothing to harm anyone else. Kedarie's mom still has his toothbrush, his clothes, all of his posters from the vigil, and she truly is so broken, but she is determined to build strength from this and make the perfect life she can for her other two children. And it's so heartbreaking to me that she is still having to fight for justice, because it's not enough in this case just to put these men behind bars, because it's not saying who Kedarie was. It's not giving him the justice for what he went through on a personal level, with the hatred that he endured from other people, from his killers, for just being him. She so desperately wants this to be a federal trial to charge them with hate crimes, but the federal authorities were involved in the investigation of this case at first, and they were going to charge it as a federal hate crime, but now it's just seemed like nothing is happening, that it just kind of fell off the radar and nobody cares to pick it up anymore. So that's why I'm telling it today, in hopes that it will bring more light to this case and that something can be done to further this case. I think it's something that needs to be done, and anybody in the LGBTQ plus community needs to feel like their rights are fought for, just as any other humans would be. I don't mean to be preachy. All I want to say is that everybody deserves respect that gives it, There's no need that we should treat people so horribly. And if this case can be one that shows that we don't put up with that kind of behavior, then we need to make an example out of these two boys. To say, no, they didn't just murder Kedarie. This was a hate crime against Kedarie for being gender fluid. That did not make it acceptable to harm him, and it never will. I hope that this changes in the future, and I hope that I can be a part of it in the future, and I would love to know any way that I can get more involved with this and become more educated about it, because I am constantly learning. I don't know all. I'm not claiming to know all, and I really hope I didn't offend anybody with this case, because I truly am doing it from my heart and not in a way that I want to be angering anybody. I just, hearing about what Kedarie went through really obviously gets me worked up. So yeah, let me know anything down below I can get involved in to help out or educate, and I will also pin it for any of you who want to get involved and educate yourselves as well. And yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.